Thanks, Jim. And I, too, would like to echo the thanks to both the CSBA team for pulling it together and my colleagues from the other think tanks. We actually, when we do this, learn a lot from one another. Makes us wonder why we don't do it more often, but perhaps we will going forward. I'm David Berteau. I'm from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and where I'm the director of our National Security Program on Industry and Resources. I'm going to try not to repeat what the others have said here, but what I would like to do is a little bit of a framing, if you will. I think the Defense Department is in a very, very difficult situation, not just in terms of the management challenge of figuring out how to put a budget together that's either consistent with the Budget Control Act spending caps or not, as the case may be. And this is what that challenge looks like. And I've actually criticized the department publicly for not stepping up to their long-term responsibility to build a fiscally disciplined program stretched out over the 5-year period of the FYDP, and to have it be consistent with, in fact, what the law says the spending cut's going to be. But look at it from DOD's perspective. If you actually make those cuts, and I think actually the sum total of our 4 exercises here reveals this, you're going to make some really bad, unacceptable decisions. And yet, you would do that in effect, you'd do that because you say, let's show you how unacceptable those cuts are, what the serious consequences of taking that much money out of defense would be. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, and Senator McCain said we have to take this discussion to our constituents, right? Let's just say, for the sake of argument, the DOD presents that unacceptably low, too high a risk budget. And the U.S. Congress looks at it and says, that ain't so bad. Why don't we take that? In fact, we've got a number of data points over the last 3 years that says the likelihood of that is actually higher than the unlikelihood. That's the challenge DOD faces. So when we lay out our results here, they essentially represent that. It's a series of unacceptable decisions from a risk point of view, from a capability point of view. What we attempt to do is to frame them in such a way that they're the least unacceptable we can come up with, or the most acceptable set of risks that we can come up with. So I wouldn't say that in any shape or form we characterize these as necessarily all recommendations, if you will. I would also note the disclaimer. I think this is probably true of all the think tanks, but CSIS itself does not take positions. So any good ideas here I should share with my colleagues, and anything that get me in trouble are probably mine and mine alone, and that should be the disclaimer. Let's see if I know how to. All right, now I know what advance means. We did assume, as a strategic focus, a continuation of the Defense Strategic Guidance from January of 2012, and that would be reflected in the soon-to-be-released National Security Strategy and the 2014 QDR. The way we, in fact, looked at implementing that with the reduced dollars associated with the final BCA caps is a strong Asia-Pacific priority, focused, though, more on engagement and presence, an increased focus on the Homeland Defense mission as a place where the threat is, in fact, emerging, with greater reliance on Guard and Reserve as part of that. We use an illustrative reliance, increased reliance on partners and allies as part of this process. And one of the questions that we'll look for when the QDR does come out is the extent to which it recognizes and accepts the need to rely on allies and partners. And we retain, to the extent possible with the dollars, both the counterterrorism and Middle East capabilities that are there today. As I said, these are not recommendations in every case. They're driven as much by the dollar level as they are by the wisdom, if you will. And I would echo what Congressman Smith said at the beginning, and I think all of us believe that there are substantial places inside the Defense Department where we could make management changes, where we could stop doing things that just add very little value for the amount of effort and save a lot of money. But both history and the limits of this exercise say that those returns are not often what we think they're going to be. And I agree with Tom Donnelly. Every contract out there has a scope of work that somebody thought was valid. Every contractor working on that scope of work believes that what they're doing is important to somebody. Every civilian that's working in the department has a job that they think matters. Getting rid of those just on a willy-nilly basis does not make sense. Figuring out what it is you stop doing and taking that out is what comes into play. And that has proven to be quite hard. So in terms of the Asia-Pacific focus, we focused a lot on increased presence, on increased engagement. I won't go through the details of the investment. Todd will show you some of that at the end. We also provided a considerable amount of additional deployed capability, increased the number of attack submarines, undersea investments, if you will, a number of assets that we both buy and deploy that complicate Chinese thinking and make it more difficult for them to figure out how they're going to operate. You know, I come out of a Cold War mentality, so it's pretty easy for me to slip into a containment approach to China. All of the work that we've done leads me to conclude that that's a flawed approach. It's not going to work. But on the other hand, the next thing you do is a little harder to figure out. If you open the cookbook of defense strategy to the Reshape China page, it's pretty blank, and we're writing it as we go here. And as a result of that, we also wanted to build and invest in additional capability. So the choices we made fit into that category, if you will. In terms of increased reliance on allies and partners, these are three illustrative examples, and they sort of fall in the category of fantasy when you come to execute them, so they may not be achievable. But in fact, I think they do illustrate the potential and the potential budgetary impact. Let me first look at the Ohio replacement program. We're moving forward with ours. Of course, ahead of us, the Brits are moving forward with their own SSBN replacement. We gamed out a scenario in which, in fact, the U.S. would accept design limits on our own Ohio replacement program in exchange for which we actually build and operate the same ship, not just the same common missile compartment, but the same submarine as the British. What this gains for us, in the game sense at least, is the capability the Brits bring to the table and not giving it up. Because one of the things that we have to trade off is, inside an analysis of alternatives framework, the sacrifice you make in terms of stealth and speed from a U.S. design point of view. On the other hand, on the other side of that seesaw is the additional capability you have of an ally who, in fact, is going to be using their tubes the same way we're using ours. And the value of that versus the loss on the capability side, very difficult. In fact, if I were CAPE, I wouldn't know how to do an AOA that did that, but we attempted to construct such a scenario here. Similarly, if you look at the deployment that Tom Donnelly described in the first and second island chain, and you look out past 2025 when the U.S. is retiring twice as many attack submarines as we're building, we need others out there with additional capable attack submarines, and the most likely place to look there is the Australians in the Collins-class replacement. And then finally, we looked at an FMS approach that, instead of the process we have today, actually creates a framework in which the U.S. tries to answer the question, if you only have so much money to spend, you, our ally or partner, this is where we think you ought to spend it, so it builds the most additional capability in the Asia-Pacific region and elsewhere. Still, we ended up having to cut a heck of a lot, if you will. And as Nora said, you have to accept risk here. The DSG basically says, the Defense Strategic Guidance basically says, if you're going to accept risk, accept it first in ground forces. We're not going to do stabilization and reconstruction. We're not going to invade anybody. There's not going to have a major ground war without mobilization, if you will. So those are our guiding principles. So we cut the heck out of the ground forces, the Army and the Marine Corps both. We tried to do it in such a way that we hedged the risk by more in the Guard and Reserves and by retaining enough capability that you could expand it more easily. So, for instance, we kept a lot more senior NCOs and mid-grade officers than the force structure would lead you to. In air and with the Navy, we maintained much of the capability we have, even though we came down to 8 carriers. That's predicated upon an assumption that we get a second forward stationing capability in the Pacific, so that the rotation coverage for those 8 carriers is essentially as much as what you have with 10 or 11. And we continue building carriers at the same rate because, in fact, once you shut that industrial base down, you never get it back, and that permeated a lot of our decisions. Good, my page is the same as my screen behind me. This is just a summary of some of the other areas. Nuclear, we did cut an ICBM wing. I mentioned the Ohio replacement alternative, if you will. A lot of protected space because that's where the near-term investments make sense. In cyber, we invested in offense, not so much in defense, because our conclusion is that cyber defense is really a national and a private sector and non-DoD public sector problem, and additional spending in DoD is not marginally valuable there. We put a lot into both in both moves of the game, increased S&T investment, protecting what Frank Kendall calls technology superiority, including investment early on in the sixth-generation fighter. In the half move, and the half move is probably not the half move that I would ask for if I were looking for legislation, because what I would do in a half move is cut less now and a lot more later. But this half move cuts a lot up front, but then you get to buy it back. So we spent it back, first of all, buying back the ground forces that we had cut. That reduces some of the risk. Secondly, buying more technology earlier. And like some of the others, what we found was that if you don't make personnel cuts now, you end up paying the price in modernization. This is actually the ultimate dilemma that Secretary Hagel laid out in the skimmer results last summer, the dilemma of capability versus capacity. How do you preserve modernization? How do you preserve the investment in programs without dramatic cuts in the capacity of your forces because they're much smaller? And with that, I'm right at 10 minutes, and I'll yield back the balance.